When Jason Rice claimed to have served 20 years off-world and then returned to his original age, a phenomenon he called the 20 and Back program, many dismissed him outright. Yet by 2025, clinicians began treating clusters of similar testimony as worth studying, with attention growing as whistleblower activity and official reviews entered public debate. That same year, the Pentagon's Anomaly Office acknowledged a surge of reported UAP incidents, a backdrop that made Rice's claims harder to ignore. He had already passed a polygraph years ago, and today the question is how reliable those results really are. The polygraph question in 2025. For decades, the polygraph has occupied an uneasy space between trust and doubt. Judged in some circles as a reliable window into truth and dismissed in others as pseudoscience, its impact has always been disproportionate to its certainty. By 2025, that debate takes on a new dimension. Polygraph discussions are no longer centered only on pulse, breath, and sweating palms, the classic signals once recorded by needles scratching across a chart. Now the conversation turns to what this technology can and cannot tell us about people like Jason Rice. When Rice originally faced an examiner years earlier, the procedure followed established routines. Sensors recorded physical indicators while precise questions were posed. At the time, the examiner's conclusion was cautious but clear. Rice's physiological readings reflected the response of someone who believed what he was saying. That did not prove that his testimony, claims of military service beyond Earth, was factually accurate. It only demonstrated that he was not registering as deceptive within the limits of the instrument. His conviction came through physiologically, which raised as many questions as it answered. What changes by 2025 is the framework for interpreting such results. New methods integrate multiple biometric signals and use artificial intelligence to map patterns across them. Instead of evaluating each input separately, like heart rate on its own or skin conductance in isolation, the updated systems search for inconsistencies across layers. A person might keep breathing steady, but if their pulse spikes or voice tremors reveal cognitive stress, the algorithms can register the mismatch. Researchers describe this as multi-modal analysis, or looking for clusters of conflict rather than isolated deviations. This broader approach does not prove whether an event truly happened, but it raises confidence in identifying whether someone is sincerely recalling what feels like memory. Rice's earlier results, when revisited through these models, showed none of the expected cross-signal contradictions. The channels moved in synchrony, with the kind of balance usually linked to memory-based recall. In other words, his testimony remains consistent with the physiological signature of recounting genuine experience, at least by present-day measures. The absence of conflict across signals doesn't establish that spacecraft or extraterrestrial encounters were real, but it reinforces that he was not fabricating his account knowingly. Skeptics have historically argued that strong-willed individuals or trained operatives could outmaneuver the polygraph by learning to regulate certain responses. They worry that practice or psychological conditioning might trick the test. In 2025, researchers emphasize that while no system is immune to manipulation, cross-signal analysis makes intentional masking far more difficult. Rather than claiming such tactics are impossible, studies suggest it is increasingly rare for people to produce convincing consistency across so many independent biometric layers. This nuance matters. The polygraph cannot certify that Rice traveled to Mars, yet it does make the case that his body aligned with the story he told. That distinction changes the center of the debate. For years, critics dismissed Rice on the assumption of deliberate invention, that he was performing a script with apparent calm. Today, the technology points elsewhere. If deception markers remain absent, then deliberate lying is no longer the most plausible explanation. Instead, we confront a deeper puzzle. If Rice truly exhibited the physiology of belief, where did that belief originate? Is it memory from actual experiences, or could it stem from another process that embeds conviction just as firmly? The implications resonate beyond Rice as an individual. Across intelligence and security communities, interest in advanced polygraph methods has grown. Agencies use them not to prove contested stories, but to gauge sincerity in sensitive disclosures. Consistency across biometric signals is now seen as a sign of genuine conviction, which can be valuable even when fact-checking the substance is impossible. In that environment, Rice's enduring alignment with truth-like indicators stands out. His case becomes a precedent for how modern tools interpret extraordinary testimony, not verifying events themselves, but clarifying whether they are performed inventions or sincerely lived in the subject's mind. Observers who once saw calmness in his old footage as evidence of rehearsal have had to reconsider. Retroactive reanalysis shows that such steadiness is consistent with memory recall, similar to soldiers recounting combat or astronauts reviewing missions. Psychologists explain that genuine recall often requires less narrative effort than fabricating detail, producing smoother biological rhythms. That smoothness is unusual among fabrications, which typically display micro-irregularities as imagination builds scenes not stored in memory. Rice's lack of such irregularity remains striking. None of this resolves the central mystery. Believing a memory does not confirm its external truth. Experiences can be shaped by trauma, suggestion, or other psychological forces that feel as real as history. Still, the current science supports one conclusion with higher certainty than before. Rice was not consciously fabricating at the time of his testimony. His physiology matched belief, not invention. That narrows but does not close the question, shifting attention from proving events to investigating how such conviction forms. This shift unsettles both advocates and opponents. Supporters cite it as validation that he is not lying, while critics are forced to look for alternative explanations beyond deliberate falsehood. In simple terms, the debate moves from "was he deceitful?" to what best accounts for his unwavering conviction. That revised frame reopens the case in a more complicated way than outright dismissal ever did. And it leaves us with a curiosity gap. If the polygraph more plausibly shows belief than fabrication, then the real inquiry becomes, what could create such specific and persistent belief? To answer that, we must look deeper into the testimonies themselves, especially the part of Rice's story that has always struck audiences as the most implausible of all. The 20 and back puzzle. The most difficult part of Jason Rice's story has always been the idea of the 20 and back program. Serving for 2 decades in an off-world role, and then returning to Earth in the same physical age stretches credibility further than many are willing to follow. For years it was dismissed as pure fantasy, the kind of tale someone might create out of personal belief mixed with science fiction influence. Yet while dismissal came easily, testimonies like Rice's did not remain isolated. By 2025, enough independent accounts had circulated that clinicians and independent investigators began looking at them together. The goal was not to prove that such a program exists, but to examine whether the similarities in these recollections reflected a recognizable pattern that demanded further study. Traditional psychology cautions against putting too much weight on memory. Decades of research have shown that recall can be reshaped by trauma, suggestion, or even the passage of time itself. By this reasoning, 20 and back could represent nothing more than elaborated false memories, individuals unknowingly filling gaps in their own histories with vivid stories that feel true. This has long been the conventional explanation for why people like Rice speak with conviction. They believe it, but belief alone is not proof. What shifted after 2024 was the scale of the data being reviewed. A single extraordinary claim can be set aside as misunderstanding, but a group of people, in different places and with no contact, describing versions of the same 20-year cycle created space for comparison. When these testimonies were placed side by side, reviewers noticed consistent narrative features, recurring gaps in memory timelines, moments where subjects described abrupt shifts in identity, and emotional stress arising at almost the exact points where their stories referenced missing decades. These similarities were striking enough that researchers began conducting formal interviews and collecting anonymized data to see how widespread such patterns might be. The interviews revealed that when subjects described ordinary life events, school, work, family, their recall resembled anyone else's. But when discussion turned to the missing years, behaviors shifted. Some individuals paused abruptly or seemed to hit an unseen boundary, as if part of their memory became inaccessible the moment they approached it. Others spoke with clarity for a time, only to stop mid-narrative in visible frustration. These interruptions did not appear random. They seemed to recur in specific places, while talking about reappearing on Earth, while recalling debriefings, or while confronting the realization that entire decades had been taken from them. To clinicians accustomed to the unpredictable variety of trauma expression, the repetition stood out. Alongside these interview findings came reports of how such memories, or the lack of them, shaped everyday life. People who identified themselves as 20 and back, participants often described unexplained disruptions in career or education paths. Some detailed sudden changes in interest or motivation, as though decisions had shifted overnight. Others spoke of struggling with long-term relationships or carrying a sense of nostalgia for connections they could not consciously place. Psychological assessments in a few cases noted fragmented personal timelines, the inner feeling of being far older than one's outward age. None of these outcomes proved the existence of space missions or regression technology, but the overlap in descriptions created a picture of recurring fallout that was difficult to ignore. A common thread in many testimonies was difficulty with stability in adulthood. Some claimed that returning from service left them restless, unable to hold one role for long. Others found that their sense of identity felt divided between an inner self carrying decades of experience and an outer self expected to resume the routine of ordinary life. When such details surfaced across unrelated accounts, investigators asked why. If these were only private fantasies, why did the aftermath look so similar? Dreams and hallucinations usually generate highly personal imagery, not shared consequences. That uniformity drew attention, not because it established fact, but because it suggested something structured was at work. In academic terms, a cautious framework developed. Instead of labeling the accounts as verified memories, some researchers began treating them as experiential clusters. These clusters are defined less by the literal story content, claims of colonies or advanced technology, and more by the structures that appear across separate reports. In this light, 20 and back is not viewed as a proven phenomenon, but as a recurring profile of cognitive and emotional expression that deserves careful documentation. Early neurological tests and structured interviews are ongoing, but support remains preliminary. Still, acknowledgement of the pattern itself marked a change from earlier years when such testimonies were dismissed outright. Rice's story became one example among many. By comparing his recollections with those of others, investigators observed the same stress reactions, the same narrative halts, and the same difficulties integrating back into daily life. None of this confirms that he served off-world or that time regression occurred, but it places his testimony within a broader constellation of accounts that exhibit repeating traits. For those collecting data, the emphasis shifted from proving events to understanding why dozens of separate individuals present the same storytelling rhythms and the same aftereffects. Skeptics remain firm in their stance. Without physical evidence or official acknowledgement, the safest explanation is still psychological construction. Yet even skeptics concede that the consistency deserves more inquiry, if only to better understand how such intense and coherent belief arises. For supporters, the overlap raises the possibility that these experiences indicate a hidden program with global reach. Between those positions lies the only point of agreement. Whatever the origin, these testimonies carry unusual continuity that cannot be dismissed as random coincidence. That continuity is what keeps the 20 and back narrative in active discussion. It may ultimately be understood as a cultural myth encoded in memory, or it may point toward realities not yet documented. At present, what can be said with confidence is limited. Multiple accounts have displayed converging features, and those features are strong enough to warrant structured research rather than ridicule. That step, modest as it is, has transformed Rice's story from an isolated outlier into part of a developing case study in how human memory and identity can be shaped by experiences at the edges of credibility. And if memory alone cannot fully explain what people report, the debate inevitably shifts to the second half of their claims, the technology said to make such service possible. The accounts do not stop at missing years. They describe transportation methods, manipulation of time, and devices unfamiliar to mainstream science. If the patterns in memory only take us so far, then the next question becomes whether the technological details at the center of these testimonies can withstand the same level of scrutiny. Portal technology, more than science fiction? When Rice described stepping into a field of shifting pressure and vibration, some dismissed it instantly as the kind of imagery borrowed from speculative fiction. Yet his framing of portal entry as resonance-based travel never disappeared from the conversation. He even compared the sensation to Earth's natural Schumann resonance, suggesting that such underlying frequencies provided a stabilizing layer that made safe passage possible. To critics, this read more like metaphor than mechanics. But in the context of 2025, with expanded investigations into how resonance fields interact with matter and the increasing seriousness of fringe concepts in physics journals, his description no longer rests entirely outside scientific language. For clarity, the Schumann resonance itself is well understood. It is not mystical or hidden. It is simply a set of low-frequency electromagnetic waves generated between Earth's surface and its ionosphere. Rice's link to those vibrations was never about their literal origin in the atmosphere, but about their role as an analogy. How stable frequencies could keep a system coherent during transition. In physics terms, this translates into the pursuit of coherence, whether aligning fields at exact frequencies can reduce distortion when matter crosses difficult thresholds. In quantum physics, coherence underpins tunneling studies. Particles are sometimes found on the far side of barriers they should not classically pass, not through brute force, but through probabilities enhanced by resonance. In laboratories, engineers work on directing such tunneling, giving it structure and repeatability. The experiments involve electrons and photons rather than people, but they show that alignment of frequency can allow passage that classical reasoning long judged impossible. This brings the discussion back to wormholes. The concept, though widely discussed, is largely confined to mathematics. Since the early 20th century, wormholes have existed as theoretical structures within Einstein's field equations. Mainstream physics acknowledges their presence in math, but stresses that for any stable, traversable wormhole to exist, materials with negative energy density, so-called exotic matter, would be essential. Without it, such structures would collapse instantly, long before anything macroscopic could pass through. Publicly, leading theoretical physicists continue to insist that this energy requirement places wormholes well outside engineering reality. Still, adjacent studies in controlled tunneling, entanglement, and resonance manipulation continue to narrow the line between fiction and science. What complicates the field further are ambiguous references in defense-related science. In recent years, partially declassified projects and research summaries have used language hinting at field manipulation and nonlinear propagation relating to energy transport. None confirm the existence of portals, and no U.S. government body has admitted to engineering such systems. However, the phrasing itself invites speculation. Technical reviewers point out that these are not terms typical of standard propulsion work, but closer to descriptions of experimental attempts to move energy or matter through unusual field dynamics. It is easy to see how whistleblowers note the overlap with their testimonies. Still, it remains important to underscore, nothing in the public record shows credible proof that human-scale traversable portals exist. Laboratory progress, though modest, does highlight phenomena that encourage speculation. Research groups have demonstrated teleportation of quantum information, a result that decades ago would have been dismissed as impossible. Photons and ions have been entangled across distances in experiments where their measured states appear linked instantaneously. Similarly, tunneling consistency has been enhanced by constructing engineered fields around experimental barriers, generating measurable increases in transmission. In the early 2020s, popular coverage of these results sometimes blurred the distinction between transporting data and transporting objects. For witnesses like Rice, the language emerging from labs seems to echo their own, even if scale and substance differ substantially. Energy demand remains the strongest counterargument. According to classical models, stabilizing a human-scale portal or wormhole would require bandwidths of power, so vast they surpass anything Earth generates. Exotic matter remains purely speculative, with no empirical sample ever confirmed. But new framing within theoretical physics emphasizes that instead of brute energy, extreme coherence might drastically reduce thresholds. If spacetime itself can be induced to cooperate through resonance alignment, then the energy requirements could be lowered. Rice's anecdotes about stepping into vibration rather than bursting through energy-heavy gateways happen to describe a similar theme. That frequency harmony allows motion. Whether coincidence or inside knowledge, the parallel with ongoing work is evident. Still, it is crucial to incorporate reality as much as imagination. In March 2023, mainstream outlets summarized federal reviews of anomalous phenomena, and one conclusion was explicit. ARO's historical reporting stated it had not found empirical evidence of off-world technology. This fact sits alongside all speculation. No portals have been observed under reproducible lab conditions, no traversable wormholes demonstrated, and no technology revealed officially by defense or civilian scientific agencies. Disclosures about defense research remain vague and cannot be used to confirm Rice's details. The scientific record holds theory and promising lab-scale anomalies, but no public confirmation of human-scale transit. This balance defines 2025's debate. On one side, physics departments at universities repeat the assessment. Wormholes are hypothetical, and portals belong in thought experiment. On the other, experimentalists uncover behaviors in matter, entanglement, tunneling, and coherence that subtly blur former boundaries. The divide is not as sharp as it was a decade ago. Concepts once scoffed at are now framed in mainstream journals as worth exploring, even when hurdles remain colossal. That slow shift creates an intellectual space that invites whistleblower testimony to be heard differently. From there arises the question of defense interest. The military is historically cautious, but also invests in speculative technologies that might someday alter logistics, energy transfer, or communications. Terms like rapid modal displacement or energy relocation, appearing in sanitized budget documents, suggest interest in conditions that at least rhyme with Rice's claims. Without disclosure, it is impossible to connect these terms directly to off-world transport. Yet even partial admissions that defense groups explore unconventional transport models help sustain attention to Rice's words. If there is a thread of practical use in this body of speculation, it lies in scale. Human passage through a portal remains unverified, but the smallest observable quanta of energy and matter have already exhibited behaviors that defy older assumptions. It is in those narrow cracks where testimony from alleged 20 and back participants finds a kind of reflection. The claims are not substantiated by official disclosure, but their imagery resonates with subsets of physics that are very much alive at the paper and laboratory level. Framed this way, Rice's account occupies a space neither wholly isolated from physics nor supported by it. The current state of knowledge tells us that no working gateways exist for human travel. Yet the fields of study he gestured toward, resonance, coherence, tunneling, are precisely those being explored seriously, albeit on microscopic scales. This overlap continues to fuel the discussion, keeping extraordinary testimony tethered, however loosely, to real experimental pathways. The scientific debate may never resolve in neat terms, but each year, and each experiment, nudges the imaginable closer to the plausible. And it raises a question that shifts attention beyond theory. If such systems did exist, what would life on the other side of them involve? That is where Rice's testimony took its boldest turn, not only describing the doorway, but also the deployments he claimed awaited beyond it. Inside off-world service, accounts of off-world duty often turn on one practical question. If such service happened, what would daily life and operations look like? Jason Rice's portrayal was matter of fact. He described bases built beneath the Martian surface, carved into rock as a safeguard against radiation and freezing temperatures. These were not shining arenas of futuristic design, but stark environments focused on survival, airflow, water recycling, and energy balance taking precedence over comfort. According to his testimony, life underground meant constant vigilance. Even a minor system failure could spell catastrophe. Critics have argued that such detail alone is not convincing. No orbiter imagery or rover expedition has ever confirmed buried facilities or large-scale construction on Mars. ARO assessments and NASA's public statements likewise report no evidence of underground complexes. That absence of proof remains central to scientific skepticism. Yet, Rice's version persisted because he continually emphasized the realities of duty cycles and maintenance schedules, describing them in ways that felt more like a soldier's report than a storyteller's embellishment. By 2024, his account no longer stood entirely on its own. Other individuals, from unrelated backgrounds, began speaking publicly about similar installations. They echoed descriptions of underground layouts not designed for spectacle, but for practicality. Long corridors with reinforced pressure locks, clustered living compartments built in modular frames, and entire systems dedicated to controlling carbon dioxide levels. Several testimonies mentioned periodic exposure to natural light through shielded domes, introduced not as luxury, but as a necessity to maintain circadian rhythm and mental health. Each of these details overlapped with fragments of Rice's older accounts. Rice had argued that hiding facilities beneath the surface explained why conventional scans would reveal little evidence of them. Newer voices did not claim special knowledge of Martian imaging data, but they also pointed to underground construction as obvious protection in a hostile environment. What lent these accounts some weight was the fact that mainstream engineering discussions had long suggested the same. Studies within NASA and other agencies proposed that subsurface habitats would be the most effective protection against cosmic radiation. These papers said nothing of secret fleets or military service, but the engineering logic paralleled what whistleblowers described. Their accounts, whatever their origin, lined up closely with real-world design necessities. Descriptions of life in the bases were equally convergent. Witnesses spoke of the rigidity of daily schedules, the necessity of strict exercise routines to counter bone and muscle loss, and medical monitoring to identify deficiencies before they escalated. Simple injuries, they reported, could become catastrophic in isolated conditions where advanced treatment was limited. Small details, the monotony of recycled air, the constant background vibration of ventilation systems, and the psychological unease of being sealed underground, appeared again and again across accounts. Rice had emphasized similar difficulties years before, and skeptics have had to contend with the consistency that emerged later on. One feature that drew attention extended beyond physical architecture: the way personnel were managed. Independent testimonies spoke of structured rotation between work areas, not purely to increase efficiency, but to reduce isolation strain. Shifts in lighting schemes, changes in duty assignments, and controlled breaks for limited exposure to daylight were all reportedly scheduled to maintain mental stability. These elements may not appear in standard science articles, yet their recurrence across multiple stories suggests a level of operational planning more typical of military or scientific mission structures. Still, strong caveats remain. Despite overlapping testimonies, no rover has transmitted usable imagery of excavation sites. No orbiter has identified surface anomalies that publicly confirm these bases, and no congressional report or defense agency has acknowledged the existence of Martian facilities. The line between credible possibility and extraordinary claim has not been crossed. For that reason, the majority view among experts remains fixed. There is no empirical evidence of active subterranean human settlements on Mars. At the same time, those assessing testimony cannot ignore the degree of overlap. Memory fabrication typically produces idiosyncratic, varied detail, rather than highly specific repetition across multiple, unconnected individuals. When multiple accounts introduce the same environmental measures, the same structural elements, and the same medical necessities, the odds of coincidence appear increasingly strained. In 2025, this compilation of similarities has made researchers more cautious about outright dismissal, even if they stop short of affirmation. The argument, then, revolves less around proving structures exist and more around explaining why the accounts align at all. Some psychologists suggest that the individuals may be drawing on the same publicly available body of popularized science, unconsciously shaping those fragments into vivid personal narratives. Others counter that while inspiration may come from shared sources, the consistency goes beyond what casual reading of articles is likely to generate. Particularly when people describe stress management tactics or modular layouts in nearly matching terms, the issue lands less in imagination and more in patterned convergence. Rice's own accounts become part of that ongoing comparative study. His memories of subterranean duty stations, once dismissed as isolated invention, have now been cataloged alongside newer testimonies. In doing so, his story has shifted from being a lone anomaly to one thread in a wider set of claims. As more testimonies have been compiled, they collectively outline protocols, protective architecture, environmental regulation, mental health strategy, that resemble mission planning documents rather than fantasy. In public debate, this tension remains unresolved. Engineers acknowledge that if humans were ever deployed on Mars, underground construction would almost certainly be the logical solution. Critics note that logic does not equal proof. Supporters cite the repeated witness overlap as unlikely coincidence. The available evidence sits squarely between feasibility and speculation, offering not certainty but persistent ambiguity. For viewers following the story, the question becomes not just what Rice alleged, but how his descriptions compare with more recent whistleblower testimonies and the official record. We'll compare those base testimonies with the newly public accounts and congressional documents to see whether a pattern is emerging that transcends fiction. And at that point, another shift takes shape. Rice no longer stands as the sole voice presenting these extraordinary claims. Others, from distinct sectors and with different backgrounds, have begun speaking about experiences that align in ways few expected. This growing chorus marks a turning point that reshapes the entire conversation about off-world service. Whistleblowers emerging after 2024. By early 2025, the arrival of new whistleblowers had shifted the discussion around extraordinary service claims into a more complex arena. Jason Rice was no longer the only one describing unfamiliar deployments or unearthly technology. Others with varied professional backgrounds had begun coming forward, moving the conversation away from a single isolated testimony and toward what appeared to be an expanding pool of overlapping accounts. These new voices did not fit neatly into one occupational mold. A handful identified as defense contractors or former intelligence officers, while others came from military aviation, naval operations, or scientific research roles adjacent to defense projects. What united their testimonies was not uniform style, but a tone of reluctance, with many emphasizing that they were not storytellers trying to seek publicity. Each appeared focused on sharing fragments of experience or observations they said had weighed on them for years. That diversity in background, paired with recurring reference points, gave their statements a reach Rice had never achieved on his own. One clear catalyst for the change was legal context. In late 2022, the U.S. Congress included explicit language within the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act that created reporting channels and whistleblower protections for individuals holding information about unidentified anomalous phenomena. By mid-2023, those protections were formally in place. This meant for the first time, service members and contractors had a defined legal pathway to report knowledge of unusual programs without fear of prosecution. Several of those who spoke in 2024 and 2025 cited these protections directly, explaining that they had waited until they knew official policy gave them cover before stepping up. Congressional hearings also provided visibility. Among the most notable cases were Jeffrey Nuxatelli, a former Navy petty officer, who described security concerns at Vandenberg Space Force Base where unusual aerial incursions had been observed, Dylan Borland, who recounted unexplained encounters while serving as a Marine, and Alexandra Wiggins, once part of operations on the USS Jackson, who testified about recurring tic-tac and orb-like devices hovering near his vessel. Their names entered the record in public hearings, which also included references to broader patterns of underreported incidents across military branches. Though these accounts remained observational rather than conclusive, the fact they were given in sworn testimony multiplied their impact. Placed beside Rice's descriptions, the overlap was striking in tone if not in perfect detail. He had spoken years earlier about unconventional craft, capsule-shaped or oblong, capable of movement that defied known propulsion. Newer testimony often mentioned similarly unconventional maneuvers, sudden accelerations, changes of direction without inertia, and in some cases, craft that disappeared into visual distortion. While no one claimed official confirmation that these were the same systems Rice described, the resemblance across narratives drew attention. Witnesses with no connection to Rice were now placing their own credibility behind reports of physics-defying technology. Skeptics persisted with familiar arguments. One was cultural exposure. Once Rice's story had circulated on forums and interviews, others could adopt elements of it, even inadvertently. But psychologists studying whistleblower accounts in 2025 noted that newer testimonies often contained details never raised by Rice himself. In hearings, for example, naval personnel described tactical procedures and security protocols unique to their branch of service. These additions did not feel like echoes of Rice. They carried the particularity of someone recalling working contexts he had no experience with. That distinction, overlap in craft descriptions but divergence in operational details, gave researchers reason to question whether imitation alone fully explained the convergence. What emerged was not proof of Rice's deployments, but a credibility multiplier. Instead of a lone claimant making extraordinary assertions, the record now showed dozens of individuals, across different years and environments, presenting testimonies that intersected on core themes. Intelligence officers described classified documents hinting at field-based propulsion tests. Naval crew recounted observations of unknown craft hovering far outside expected flight envelopes. Defense contractors alluded to energy studies whose language mirrored fringe physics speculation. Standing alone, each account could still be doubted. Together, they forced a reassessment of whether the subject required structured investigation. Another development was the reframing of terminology. As of 2025, unidentified anomalous phenomena had displaced UFOs as the phrase of record, both in Pentagon documents and congressional discussions. The change aligned with treating these matters as issues of national security and aviation safety, rather than cultural oddities. Witnesses like Nuxatelli and Wiggins were not presented as enthusiasts. They were military professionals describing incursions, flight risks, and violations of restricted airspace. This formal reframing mattered. It shifted the official ground beneath whistleblower testimony, making Rice's earlier words appear slightly less distant from current institutional language. The media added fuel through productions like the 2025 documentary, The Age of Disclosure. Featuring interviews with more than 30 insiders, the film alleged an 8-decade cover-up of recovered craft and biological bodies. While critics challenged its sourcing, the timing made a difference. Released amid hearings and policy safeguards, it reached audiences more prepared to treat the testimony inside as a contribution to an ongoing national conversation. In this way, Rice's testimony stopped being just an outlier on a podcast and began to occupy space inside a broader framework of alleged insider knowledge. Detractors still hold the stronger ground on evidence. No public data confirms that human personnel have served on other planets. No verified images show underground Martian bases or portals activating. NASA continues to release Martian probes without reference to life or infrastructure. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office has repeated that it has not collected documentation confirming extraterrestrial control of unusual craft. In light of these statements, mainstream assessment continues to categorize Rice's personal story as unsubstantiated. Yet even skeptics acknowledge the climate has shifted. Where once Rice could be dismissed as a single voice recounting unverifiable episodes, by 2025 his words are surrounded by a constellation of testimonies pointing towards similar themes. Advanced craft, anomalous beings, underground environments, and secrecy disguised inside defense programs. Each additional voice does not solve the credibility question, but their presence ensures institutions must at least account for them. Silence from officials is no longer as easy to maintain when multiple active duty or recently retired personnel are speaking publicly. The central question becomes less about proving the literal existence of deployed interstellar soldiers and more about how many independent professionals have now linked their names to the possibility of concealed technology. Consistency across branches and job roles, Air Force installations, naval decks, defense contracts, underscores that this is no longer a cultural fringe subject, but one appearing regularly in closed, and now occasionally open, governmental hearings. Legal structures, public testimony, and growing transparency have worked together to change perception. Rice's role remains foundational. He was one of the first to go on record. But the focus of attention has shifted away from him as an individual and toward the collective weight of voices emerging after protections were put in place. That weight is what calls for further institutional review rather than dismissal, not because any one account proves the case, but because convergence itself is harder to ignore. It is within this atmosphere that attention begins to settle on the next layer of the story, how the Department of Defense itself has adjusted its position. Historically, the Pentagon relied on firm denials, often attributing sightings to weather, balloons, or atmospheric distortion. But as testimonies continue building and oversight inquiries deepen, quiet indications from within official reports challenge that long-standing stance. The Pentagon's quiet admissions. For decades, the Department of Defense held a consistent public stance. Unidentified objects were either misperceptions of balloons, atmospheric events, or conventional aircraft. Official studies spanning from the late 1940s through Project Blue Book reinforced that message. Reports were filed, reviewed, and almost without exception dismissed. Within that framework, testimonies like Jason Rice's could be written off as fabrications or fantasies without serious review. In 2025, however, the official language has shifted. Full endorsement of extraordinary claims has never appeared, but the habit of complete denial no longer defines the Pentagon's position. The clearest marker of change came with the creation of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office in July 2022, mandated under the fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. For the first time, the Pentagon was legally required to build a permanent body to collect and standardize reports across land, sea, air, and space. Just 2 years later, in November 2024, ARO reported that it had cataloged 757 incidents between May 2023 and June 2024, while also incorporating older cases that had gone unreported at the time. The scale alone demonstrated that UAP observations were not fringe curiosities. They had become the subject of regular logging, analysis, and public reporting by a Department of Defense office. That massive dataset revealed a striking detail. Nearly 50 of those recorded incidents were reported at altitudes above 100 kilometers, the formal boundary of space. Civilian reports of objects in orbit had circulated for decades, but an official record placing unidentified phenomena in the operational zone of satellites was new. The entry did not prove extraordinary technology, but it confirmed formally that fleeting observations in space existed, and they had found a place inside Pentagon files. For scientists, that raised caution. For analysts and veterans of the whistleblower debate, it indicated acknowledgement that the problem extended beyond atmospheric mirages. Still, AARO's November report outlined the limits with equal force. The findings concluded that most events were the products of misidentification, whether balloons, natural optical phenomena, or standard aircraft glimpsed under unexpected conditions. And critically, its authors wrote that there was no empirical evidence supporting claims of extraterrestrial technology or reverse engineering programs. That statement directly contradicted the stories of recovered craft and exotic materials that Rice and others had long associated with their experiences. Moreover, AARO investigated the Kona Blue program often cited in such stories and found that, far from being an operational recovery division, it was a mere proposal never approved or funded. From AARO's point of view, reports of retrieved non-human biologics fell into myth rather than history. AARO's historical review extended decades backward. It re-examined events from 1945 onward, from nuclear-era sightings to major incidents like Roswell. Its conclusion reinforced the familiar line: misidentifications explain the overwhelming majority of cases, and no verifiable evidence exists for off-world craft. Even iconic episodes like Roswell were reaffirmed as balloon experiments from Project Mogul. In one sense, this underscored the Pentagon's rejection of Rice's central claims. And yet, even within that rejection, subtle changes showed through. The ambiguity came in the way the documents treated propulsion and technology research. Some redacted procurement entries, along with phrasing in declassified material, stirred speculation. Technical phrases such as field displacement mechanisms appeared in reference to experimental propulsion concepts. For most readers, these sounded like advanced aeronautics proposals. But to supporters of Rice, they echoed the language he once used to describe capsules or vehicles that moved outside normal aerodynamic principles. Analysts carefully note, while such language exists in official documents, AARO's comprehensive review emphasized no empirical evidence connects this research to alien origin. On paper, the Department of Defense admits only to investigating unusual aerodynamics and energy systems in the context of human experimentation, not extraterrestrial recovery. This produces a contrast that frames the debate in 2025. On one side are the official statements, categorical in their rejection of extraterrestrial technology, and clear about the non-operational status of rumored programs. On the other are the natural questions raised by procurement records and the echo between technical wording and independent testimonies like Rice's. The admissions, in other words, are not sensational confirmations of off-world technology. They are acknowledgments that systematic logging exists, that some incidents remain unexplained, and that certain advanced propulsion studies pursue concepts, such as drag reduction by field manipulation, that surface in whistleblower interviews. This dual message explains why observers call it a quiet shift. Denial has softened into formal review, but proof still evades release. Legislation reinforces that directional change. The NDA of 2023 built specific confidential reporting channels for service members, contractors, and former employees holding information about UAP. Crucially, the law carved out legal protection so that disclosures to AARO were not violations of non-disclosure agreements. That provision exists only on the assumption that relevant knowledge is tucked within classified programs. The following year, the NDA of 2024 expanded the scope further, requiring the National Archives to build a public UAP records collection. Agencies across government were ordered to forward documents relating to anomalous phenomena or systems of unknown origin, with a presumption of disclosure. In practical terms, denial was no longer an option across the bureaucracy. The law forced cataloging and transparency. If nothing were worth studying, such channels and archives would be unnecessary. And if retrieval projects had no basis at all, there would be no reason to promise whistleblowers protection from reprisal. Those legislative facts themselves create the context where speculation persists, regardless of AARO's careful disclaimers. Rice's testimony remains unverified, but his descriptions of advanced transport align thematically with the propulsion references scattered through procurement paperwork. For critics, this is coincidence or reinterpretation. For his supporters, it is evidence that military research shadows at least part of what he described. Both sides agree on one thing. The official record of 2025 looks different from the blunt denials that lasted for 70 years. That change alters how earlier testimonies are received. Rice once stood as a solitary claimant, easily dismissed. Now his words exist in a world where the Pentagon tracks hundreds of anomalous cases, acknowledges observations in near orbit, and releases documents hinting at advanced propulsion research. None of that proves his participation in a 20 and back program, but it prevents dismissal as fantasy without consequence. Testimonies like his now sit beside formal reports, separated by the gap between denial of alien origin and acknowledgement of anomalous realities. This convergence, without offering confirmation, provides enough overlap to shift the climate of public debate. The effect is a new kind of ambiguity. Official reports go further than past denials by documenting scale and publishing case counts. But they remain clear about their conclusions. No verifiable extraterrestrial technology has ever been retrieved. Between those poles lies a tension where whistleblower statements and procurement fragments stir questions the reports refuse to answer. That is where Rice's testimony now lives, in the intersection between formal acknowledgement of anomalies and firm denial of the extraordinary interpretation. That ambiguity, public collection, paired with official denial, sets the background for another development. As the discussion moves forward, attention falls not only on offices analyzing data, but on the branch of the military newly responsible for space itself. Space Force's mysterious evolution. What role does the United States Space Force occupy in 2025 beyond its official mission statements? Publicly, the branch emphasizes satellite protection, orbital monitoring, and cybersecurity in space. The rhetoric paints it as a natural upgrade from Air Force Space Command, adapted to a world where satellites carry much of the weight for communication, navigation, and intelligence. Press releases highlight orbital debris management, international coordination, and training for cyber resilience. None of this is especially controversial. It looks technical, serious, and squarely tied to existing defense needs. That is the visible narrative. Behind that facade, however, indicators point to broader responsibilities. Space Force activity and procurement priorities have visibly expanded in recent years, and its operational remit increasingly overlaps with unidentified anomalous phenomena monitoring. This shift aligns it with larger institutional efforts like those of AARO, which now relies heavily on military sensor networks to collect and interpret data across multiple intelligence streams. When a service branch is managing some of the most advanced orbital detection systems available, its public outline of satellite awareness begins to look like only part of the picture. Observers who compare budget trajectories to stated missions note that the increases are difficult to justify solely by satellite upkeep or cyber tasks. Satellites and cyber defense projects scale steadily, not exponentially. The sudden rise in classified procurement line items marked simply as aerospace vehicle evaluation or advanced propulsion testing is what fuels outside speculation. Because the phrasing is vague and heavily redacted, no paper trail ties these efforts directly to exotic craft. Yet the fact that these descriptions appear at all has been enough to keep analysts watching closely, especially given how similar they sound to elements of whistleblower testimonies. For those who remember Jason Rice's words, the echoes are unavoidable. He spoke of capsule-like vehicles, silent ascent through the atmosphere, and maneuvers far outside the reach of standard propulsion. Procurement language between 2023 and 2025 does not mention spacefaring capsules or portal mechanics, but scattered references to performance testing and unusual vehicle shapes invite comparison. Coincidence cannot be ruled out, yet the overlapping terminology provides fertile ground for speculation. The controversy lies less in what is confirmed than in the way the wording resonates with established accounts. In practice, the Space Force operates sensor arrays that are capable of more precise tracking than nearly any other system on Earth. Designed to warn of debris smaller than a coin, these tools are perfectly suited to cataloging unexplainable movements in low orbit or beyond. That capability explains why ARO's framework leans on multi-INT, geospatial, signals, and measurement intelligence drawn from Space Force systems whenever unidentified incidents need verification. This makes the branch a natural partner in anomaly study, even if no public official uses the term openly. Whether cataloging standard debris or examining unexplained flight paths, Space Force is the silent backbone of technical observation. The paradox is stark. Outwardly, the service maintains an image of satellites, training, and cyber readiness. Internally, implied by procurement language and classified budgets, it appears tied to evaluating technologies that go further than routine platform defense. But clarity stops there. No document verifies Rice's claims of off-world movement or portal travel. What exists is a record of activity suggesting more ambitious aerospace objectives than the press releases disclose. Skeptics point out that all militaries allocate funds for classified programs, and that spending spikes reflect launch vehicles, new communications constellations, or missile defense satellites. These explanations are plausible, yet when expenditures scale at rates comparable to the rollout of stealth bombers or nuclear fleets, questions emerge about whether satellites alone account for the totals. The technology associated with raw orbital awareness does not typically require outlays of that magnitude. To critics of dismissal, the math looks more like the cost of entire vehicle platforms. Defense contractors reinforce that perception. Since 2023, several have registered patents focusing on reduced drag systems, plasma sheaths to shield craft, and field-based propulsion. While patents never prove functionality, they do reveal corporate attention. Engineers are devoting resources to concepts once considered speculative. For Rice, who described transport capsules bending their environment rather than burning fuel, such developments appear like distant confirmation. For neutral analysts, they remain intriguing alignments with unproven credibility. Within this climate, Space Force evolves less as a simple administrative branch and more as a node where unexplained technology discourse overlaps with real procurement. It houses essential detection systems, shares data with ARO, and writes contracts that emphasize aerospace testing without detail. That ambiguity ensures that speculation continues. Some see early steps toward craft resembling whistleblower descriptions, while others see ordinary classified development obscured by secrecy. The evidence confirms neither narrative outright, but it sustains the debate by refusing to settle on one interpretation. The precision of modern sensors pushes Space Force deeper into this dual role. By cataloging every glint of orbital debris, it also captures anomalies in motion that older radar systems would never detect. These feeds feed directly into multi-intelligence reviews, ensuring that unexplained objects are logged, if not always explained. In effect, the branch functions as the surveillance hub for anomalies, whether or not it admits the term. When analysis finds nothing unusual, it strengthens skepticism. But when maneuvers remain unexplained, speculation rises, particularly when budget expansions suggest new technology being tested under the same sky. This tension ensures that Rice's testimony is read differently now than it once was. Alone, his descriptions seemed outlandish. Today, surrounded by evidence of procurement growth, sensor monitoring, and patents exploring unconventional design, they take on a comparative weight. Not proof, but context. The line between unverified memory and classified possibility grows thinner, not because facts have been released, but because new structures of secrecy and procurement overlap with old claims. In 2025, Space Force embodies that ambiguity. It is simultaneously what it says, an operator of satellite constellations, and what whistleblower speculation insists. A branch channeling massive sums into advanced systems hidden behind classification. Its role in anomaly analysis is official, though understated, and its budgets hint at efforts beyond everyday orbital planning. For those following Rice's story, this institutional evolution is not confirmation, but it does keep his testimony tethered to visible structures rather than drifting in isolation. What emerges most clearly is that Space Force has transitioned from a straightforward defense upgrade into something harder to categorize. The branch is expanding its reach, linking with anomaly investigators, and commissioning work described only in careful, ambiguous language. In that mirror, Rice's testimony begins to look like a story that fits the environment rather than one that floats outside it. Whether coincidence or something more remains unanswered. And yet, spacecraft and budgets are only part of the account. Beyond equipment and monitoring systems, Rice also spoke of encounters that reached beyond machinery. Those details, far stranger than procurement language, center not on vehicles but on who or what he claimed to meet once those missions began. Alien contact, the shared descriptions. What Rice claimed to encounter were not only bases or vehicles, but beings. He described them without hesitation, short in height, with disproportionately large dark eyes and facial features so reduced that expression looked incomplete by human standards. These details fascinated some listeners, while others dismissed them as nothing more than the familiar alien image popularized by half a century of media. The central debate has always been whether such clarity reflects memory grounded in lived experience, or simply a narrative shaped by cultural archetypes. One important counterweight to the discussion came with official statements. AARO's historical review, completed in 2024, explicitly concluded it had found no empirical evidence of off-world technology or recovered beings. That remains the baseline of the government record. No verified biological data links unidentified phenomena to extraterrestrial origin. Still, reports of similar-looking entities appear repeatedly in testimony and case files made public between 2023 and 2025 through congressional hearings, interviews with military personnel, and some redacted documents released under pressure. Within those sources, witnesses often gave physical descriptions that echoed Rice's outline. These testimonies were varied in origin. A former Navy petty officer recalled odd incursions on a base perimeter, including reports that objects appeared to land silently in nearby fields. In a separate Defense Scoop referenced account, service members described darkened silhouettes behind craft windows, noting unusual proportions, short in stature and dominated by eyes. Other accounts entered congressional records from pilots who claimed fleeting views of occupants through transparent panels. While no biological evidence emerged, these statements carried weight because they came from trained personnel, often speaking under oath or within institutional frameworks. The descriptions themselves were remarkably consistent, even when witnesses came from different continents or cultural contexts. They typically focused on three recurring features: compact bodies rarely above 5 feet, eyes far larger than the human ratio, and minimal nose and mouth structure. Some observers noted the lack of expressive movement or the absence of visible communication. That set of traits is narrower than the broad, big-eyed alien trope and has appeared in multiple testimonies made independently of one another. Exactly why the overlap persists is what drives the controversy. Critics counter that shared imagery is not surprising. The so-called gray alien has saturated popular culture for decades. Anyone exposed to films, books, or even news stories could unconsciously reproduce the template. From this view, the repetition undermines, rather than strengthens, the testimony. But researchers in 2025 noted that many cautionary explanations, such as mass delusion or hallucination, usually result in highly varied visual outcomes, not precise repetition cross-culturally. The striking uniformity of these testimonies is what differentiates the debate and keeps the interest alive. One often discussed case involved an air crew in South America who reported in 2025 that two small figures briefly exited a landed object before retreating. Their written record described glass-like eyes reflecting floodlights and bodies compact and childlike. The phrasing, redacted but later released, sounded nearly identical to what Rice had described years earlier. Another entry, this time referenced in documentation from Eastern Europe, came from villagers who reported figures visible through panels of a hovering craft. Once again, the key descriptors aligned: undersized beings, enlarged eyes, subdued faces. Supporters argue that these repeating elements, surfacing across unaffiliated testimonies, suggest something more than shared cultural imagination. But even sympathetic analysts stress that alignment in description does not equal evidence of alien origin. The record remains limited to human words on paper. There are no physical samples, no uncontested photographs, and no verified long-form recordings to supplement the claims. Testimony alone, however compelling in consistency, falls short of proof. Why these contours, short, dark-eyed figures with faint mouths, arise so frequently has become the pivotal question. Some psychologists suggest a universal archetype embedded in the human psyche, producing similar imagery when people grapple with unknowns. Others argue that repeated testimony under secure conditions, especially from service professionals, deserves more consideration than casual dream reporting or cultural folklore. For Rice's supporters, the possibility that these forms are remembered reality remains open. For detractors, cultural priming explains the entire phenomenon. The debate therefore hinges on pattern recognition. If a single man makes such claims, the story can be dismissed as fabrication. If hundreds repeat similar figures across settings and years, the line between coincidence and corroboration blurs. Researchers highlight subtler consistencies, reports of restrained movement, the lack of noticeable speech, and uniform clothing that extend beyond the standard alien stereotype. Whether this represents psychological projection or recurring elements of genuine encounters, no consensus exists. It is important to underline that convergence still does not equal confirmation. Even when testimony runs parallel across continents, the official record maintains that material evidence is missing. ARO stands firm. After evaluating more than 8 decades of cases, it has not verified any biological remains or off-world technology. The contrast between growing witness testimony and the neutrality of official conclusions creates the ambiguity where Rice's story now resides. For those comparing sources, his descriptions no longer sit alone. They exist beside statements from military aviators, radar operators, and civilians who claim to have seen near-identical beings. That context shifts his image from an isolated fantasy to part of a larger archive of repeating accounts. Whether those accounts capture external reality or a persistent internal template of human imagination remains unresolved, and it is precisely in that uncertainty where debate thrives. What emerges is a conversation less about fantasy or fact, and more about the meaning of repetition. If multiple populations, separated by geography and culture, describe the same features in comparable ways, the phenomenon demands explanation. Explanations differ, shared archetypes, cultural seeding, or genuine encounters, but the repetition itself cannot be ignored. Testimony builds weight through volume, though it does not cross the threshold into scientific validation. For Rice, the unexpected convergence means his portrait of encountered beings has gained a degree of external resonance it once lacked. For skeptics, it is proof only of how powerful cultural images become once seated in the public mind. Between these poles lies the enduring impasse. Memory, however detailed, is not confirmation. Official assessments insist that tangible biological evidence must surface before any claim of contact can be treated as fact. And yet, the discussion leaves a further puzzle unresolved. If these accounts are to be taken seriously, even at the level of shared psychological construct, then the question becomes less about the beings themselves and more about the human cost of believing one has lived among them. Many of the individuals making these claims describe enduring aftereffects that go well beyond the sighting event itself, raising questions about what happens to memory, identity, and stability when years of life are tied to such extraordinary testimonies. Psychological fallout from 20 missing years. The cost of testimony often appears not in the claims themselves, but in what it leaves behind. For those who say they endured a 20 and back service cycle, the disruption is not simply about extraordinary memories. It is about the psychological fallout of returning with years missing from one's life, and the quiet instability that arrives when identity no longer matches the calendar. The program is said to end with a reset, memory suppressed, age regressed, continuity restored. But accounts in 2025 paint a different picture. The erasure is incomplete, and fragments leak into daily life in ways that reshape careers, relationships, and personal well-being. Whistleblowers commonly describe aftereffects that follow a recurring pattern. Some report abrupt life changes, ending one career path, relocating without clear reasons, abandoning friendships as if compelled by an unseen instinct. Others speak of emotional dislocation, waking in familiar homes yet feeling displaced, as though lives did not quite belong to them. There is also the difficulty of sustaining long-term commitments. Marriages collapse or drift when one partner carries the weight of unexplainable inner shifts. And across testimonies, the fear of stigma looms large, intensified by retaliation pressures for speaking in public. Veterans who came before Congress in 2023 and 2024 described career impediments, delayed promotions, or lost opportunities simply because they reported anomalous incursions. That kind of systemic resistance magnifies the mental burden for anyone already struggling with missing time. A strong example is found in public testimony from service members like Jeffrey Nuxatelli, who spoke openly to House Oversight staff about UAP encounters near Vandenberg Space Force Base. He explained that witnessing unexplained events was compounded by a lack of guidance, leaving personnel uncertain how to respond. His account underscored the theme familiar in Rice's story. It wasn't only the experience itself that caused strain, but also the silence and institutional avoidance that followed. This mirrored the struggles of others, such as Dylan Borland or Alexandra Wiggins, who reported incidents and faced skepticism or professional consequences. What emerges through these hearings is less about isolated anecdotes than about common patterns of alienation and stress. For those who identify specifically with the 20 and back model, the inner tension manifests in subtler ways. A frequent description is the sensation of carrying an age that does not match the birth date on their paperwork. Some say they feel decades older, with perspectives, temperaments, or weariness that unsettles partners and families. A spouse who expects to live beside a 30-year-old suddenly encounters someone who moves and thinks as though burdened by an extra lifetime. These symptoms appear not as hallucinations, but as a mismatch between inner time and public record. Others describe recurring moments of feeling out of place, standing in a room they know logically is theirs but sensing for minutes at a time that they should be elsewhere. Clinical observers in 2024 and 2025 noted that these reports did not fit neatly into standard categories of post-traumatic stress. PTSD is driven by intrusive memory, flashbacks, or nightmares that replay trauma. In the Rice-style accounts, participants do not relive, but instead confront absences. Their stress origin lies in absence rather than intrusion. Blank zones in consciousness, discontinuity in life narratives, vacuums where stories ought to be. Clinicians describe these pauses in testimony as unusually consistent across subjects, recommending that neurological and psychological research focus on how memory suppression or dissociation might operate in cases of extreme stress. Importantly, these were calls for study, not final diagnoses. Caution remains essential. What exists at present are recurring patterns in how subjects describe their lives, not proven biomarkers of a distinct disorder. The lived consequences are concrete. Whistleblowers describe reluctance to make future plans because commitments feel unsafe without certainty about the past. Others mention sudden temptations toward relocation or career overhaul without knowing what triggers those impulses. Families sometimes frame these behaviors as instability, compounding feelings of isolation. This was then layered with the external stigma of disclosure. Veterans who gave sworn testimony complained that colleagues mocked or deliberately excluded them once their reports became public. Some described being warned their careers would stagnate if they continued pushing concerns about anomalous phenomena. The combination of identity dislocation and professional retaliation created stress landscapes too complex to reduce to a single diagnosis. Public comment added weight to these findings. Luis Elizondo, who once directed the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, spoke of receiving threats from inside the intelligence apparatus. He explained that high-ranking figures had discussed extreme options to silence disclosure. He described this not to dramatize, but to illustrate the real psychological pressure placed on individuals who cross institutional guardrails. Living under such conditions, knowing careers can crumble, reputations can shatter, and in some cases safety might be at risk, produces anxiety, hypervigilance, and paranoia consistent with trauma. When combined with memory discontinuity, the results form a picture of distress unique in its structure, if not yet in its clinical recognition. By 2025, some researchers propose that what is needed is not a rush to redefine psychiatric categories, but a formal research agenda. That agenda would mean longitudinal study of individuals reporting 20 and back style experiences, careful neurological testing, and the creation of protected reporting channels free from stigma. Without such safeguards, these testimonies continue to circulate in fragmented forms, interpreted solely by skeptics or enthusiasts. A structured medical setting would allow patterns to be confirmed or disproven systematically. Universities and federal health agencies have already been urged to examine whether dissociative phenomena, memory suppression, or artificial trauma models could account for the testimonies. Thus far, the field remains exploratory, but the call for transparent scientific investigation has grown louder. Humanizing these discussions matters. During recent congressional panels, veterans described not abstract theories but the practical toll: jobs lost, peers' trust eroded, families fractured. Their accounts carried emotion that no chart or scan could fully convey. For Rice and others like him, the struggle has always been not only proving what happened, but enduring the consequences of being treated as unreliable narrators of their own lives. That emotional landscape, the mix of resilience, doubt, and dislocation, represents the enduring weight behind the 20 and back narrative, separate from its factual verification. Removing the stigma surrounding anomalous testimony is not a trivial demand. It echoes past lessons from earlier wars, when returning soldiers endured years of untreated trauma because the concept of battle fatigue, or PTSD, had not yet been accepted. Today's whistleblowers, describing missing years and fractured identities, find themselves at a similar boundary, dismissed until data compels formal recognition. Clinicians stress that care must not wait for permanent proof. The suffering described, strains in marriages, lost stability, enduring paranoia, deserves attention in its own right. If those programs actually occurred, the psychological cost exposes a moral debt. If they did not occur, and these testimonies derive from broader cultural or cognitive phenomena, then medicine faces an unsolved puzzle that still requires study. In both cases, the existence of repeated, consistent descriptions highlights a human burden that continues whether or not official verification arrives. The persistence of missing years in memory, however interpreted, points to a collective challenge not answered by dismissal. And this leads to a more pressing question. If the psychological weight is real, what does that imply about the experiences themselves? For years, debate centered on credibility, but by 2025 the issue extends beyond evaluation into consequence. The accounts of trauma leave one unavoidable possibility: that the service some describe might not be an illusion, but a hidden part of our history. The implications of that possibility reach further than neuroscience or mental health, into questions about where humanity may already have been, and what unacknowledged chapters of our story remain obscured. Humanity's hidden space presence in 2025. Thinking about a hidden human presence in space in 2025 brings the discussion to its sharpest point. What if at least some of these testimonies are accurate? The issue then is not only about extraordinary vehicles or erased memories, but about a history written without public knowledge. It suggests that while society looks forward to a future of exploration, part of that future may already exist out of view. What emerges in this context is a tension between expanding openness and the limits of what governments will acknowledge. That tension has a legislative structure behind it. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was born out of the fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, the first time Congress directed a permanent office to track, catalog, and analyze anomalous incidents across air, sea, space, and multi-domain environments. A year later, the 2023 Defense Bill required historical reviews reaching back to 1945 and extended explicit whistleblower protections for people holding UAP-related knowledge. And by 2024, new law mandated the creation of a UAP records collection at the National Archives, built on a presumption of immediate disclosure. These three milestones mark a remarkable reversal in policy, from default secrecy to statutory pressure for openness. The results of this framework are visible. ARO publicly released case tallies, 757 incidents logged between May 2023 and mid-2024, and acknowledged dozens of reports at altitudes above 100 kilometers, formally placing unidentified events in near space. It integrated directly with intelligence agencies such as the NGA, NSA, and DIA, giving its analysts access to satellite imaging and signals data. Civilian reporting expanded too, as the Federal Aviation Administration began sharing pilot encounters to reduce military bias in the caseload. Step by step, processes that were once hidden shifted into visible institutions, with Congress demanding that classified excuses yield to public transparency unless true national security threats justified secrecy. Despite these advances, full disclosure remains out of reach. Reports appear heavily redacted. Photographs lose resolution before release. Retrieval efforts are acknowledged in principle, but described in official reviews as inconclusive, with ARO stressing in its public report that no empirical evidence supports claims of recovered alien craft or biologics. This means that the most spectacular elements of whistleblower stories, downed vehicles tucked away in warehouses or non-human remains studied in labs, are still listed officially as unproven. The contrast between government admissions and government denials creates the gray area where testimonies like Jason Rice's continue to live. This gray area is what fuels speculation. Those inclined to doubt whistleblowers point to ARO's definitive language: no verified recovery, no confirmed extraterrestrial technology. Those inclined to believe point to the scale of the caseload, the existence of recovery programs at least in proposal form, and the explicit legislative push to shine light on past concealment. Neither position fully cancels out the other. What exists is a hybrid, enough official acknowledgement of anomalies to move the subject out of ridicule, paired with clear refusals to validate claims about secret space deployment or non-human intelligences. Beyond government agencies, another development is the rise of international sharing and civilian science. The secrecy that once defined UAP studies has loosened as academic conferences now convene across borders to compare radar data, satellite tracks, and flight path anomalies. Physicists propose frameworks for propulsion mechanisms outside conventional models, while astronomers analyze unexplained sky events recorded by wide-field surveys. Universities no longer avoid the subject as automatically disreputable. Alongside civilian pilots' reports now streaming into AARO, this wider academic participation signals that the study of anomalies has been normalized, not proven, but normalized enough to be openly pursued. Consider what this broader landscape means when compared to Rice's testimony. When he first described long deployments and contact with beings, his words were easily dismissed against a backdrop of uniform government denial. By 2025, the situation is different. His stories now sit beside layers of partial confirmation, logged incidents, open hearings, mandated records collections, and international research forums. None declare that a 20 and back program exists, but they create an environment where the possibility of hidden chapters cannot be brushed aside so easily. The culture of secrecy has cracked, leaving space for testimonies to attach themselves to official activity. If at some level these testimonies are accurate, the implications would be profound. They would mark a missing chapter in public history where members of our own species lived and worked beyond Earth without acknowledgement. The human story as taught around the world would be incomplete. Service performed in environments never discussed in textbooks would remain off the record, and sacrifices made under secrecy would not be counted in any public roll of honor. That hidden history, if it exists, reframes what it means to say humanity is spacefaring. But it is crucial to restate, the official record available today does not confirm that possibility. AARO's conclusions remain cautious, limiting the evidence to unexplained phenomena and denying physical proof of extraterrestrial craft or beings. This underscores the need for careful balance between what is documented and what is claimed. Publicly documented facts include the establishment of AARO under the 2022 NDAA, the historical review and whistleblower protection measures of 2023, and the legally required records collection created in 2024. We also have the confirmed caseload of anomalous incidents, the integration of intelligence resources, and testimony from service members given under oath. What remains unproven, according to AARO itself, are the cornerstones of whistleblower narratives: recovered off-world technology, confirmed extraterrestrial biologics, and direct evidence of human participation in space-based secret deployments. That clarity lets viewers distinguish between the growing public record and the unverified territory where memory and testimony still dominate. Yet, even with these boundaries, the shift has been dramatic. What once lived solely in rumor now circulates in congressional hearings, academic symposia, and media reports subject to scrutiny. The fact that lawmakers question the completeness of intelligence briefings and legally mandated transparency through the National Archives reflects a recognition that the issue cannot be perpetually contained. Whether or not hidden service programs have ever existed, we are already witnessing history. The moment when governments and scientific communities began to treat anomalies not as dismissals, but as data. The cultural effect of this shift is subtle but powerful. Public imagination no longer needs to leap from nothing to believe in hidden deployments. It can now point to official reports of unexplained incidents in orbit. Scientists and pilots no longer operate in isolation. They participate in networks designed to compare and analyze anomalies systematically. And citizens no longer rely only on rumor or myth. They can read fragments of released records that show at minimum the scale of what has been observed. Even without proof of beyond-Earth service, this combination repositions testimony from the fringe to the edge of official discourse. Looking ahead, the debate will ride on this boundary. If redacted pages one day yield concrete evidence, testimonies like Rice's will take on the weight of vindication. If they do not, their consistency will remain something for psychologists and cultural analysts to explain rather than historians. Either way, the question of humanity's hidden space presence in 2025 is no longer idle speculation. It is now a matter shaped by law, institutions, and the public record. And so the question turns outward. Which piece of this picture resonates most with you? The admissions ARO has made, the credibility of whistleblowers, or the stubbornly redacted files that leave gaps in the record? Tell us in the comments where you place your trust and what you think the missing pages of history might contain. This unresolved tension sets the stage for a larger understanding. What started as extraordinary individual testimony now intersects with agencies, legislation, science, and psychology, suggesting that the line between memory and history is thinner than it once appeared. Rice's case now sits at an unusual crossroads, where polygraph results, overlapping whistleblower testimony, and incomplete official records all converge. Some see echoes of memory, others see only cultural repetition, yet the testimony won't disappear from public discourse. At the same time, ARO has logged hundreds of incidents and released data showing dozens in near space, while still concluding there is no verifiable evidence of recovered craft or off-world technology. That contrast between data transparency and denied confirmation creates the unresolved gap that drives debate forward. And that gap matters. If you want to keep this conversation alive, like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments which piece of evidence you found most persuasive.